India, on top of those, did something very unusual.
Just when Mrs. Gandhi comes back to power,
This is the new war, right?
the army was called.
Will not be allowed to flourish.
It's a big picture book.
This has left scars.
It reached 1 million.
Professors, to start with, you've spoken at length about how you came across many surprises during the course of, while working on the book, right? The first 30 years of independent India, import substitution wasn't really that. It was basically a period of deep scarcity is what you found. Southern states, they were doing better than Hindi heartland states, but also the fact that they were doing as well as China for a period as long as 40 years, right? So many surprises. But to begin with, I'd like to ask, what has the reception been like? Any surprises there, pleasant or maybe not so pleasant?
Firstly, look, to be honest with you, we were a bit anxious about the book because it's long, it's full of data, and it is basically, somewhat technical. Although we were inspired by and drew upon Ram Guha's India After Gandhi, because we wanted to write something that was, rigorous, data-driven, but also accessible. That was a big anxiety here.
I was not at all anxious. You write, first of all, we know what's out there. There's that old story that two men are running from a bear, and one says, we've got to run faster to escape the bear. And the other says, no, I just have to run faster than you. And in a similar way, when you write a book, there is an objective standard. There's also a relative standard. And we know what's out there. We know how hard we worked. We know how much effort we made to make it accessible, not for academics, but for a broader audience.
The first question to you, Dr. Kapoor, is that you talked about bloodshed, right, in the process of nation building, state building. In fact, you presented data of the partition period, right, and as a percentage of the population, you've shown how little it is when compared to other countries, right? You spoke about order, but the thing is, one of the first things to come, whether it is a democracy or an autocracy, right, or in a country that has an autocracy, is order. Right? It's an attribute of a state, whether it's democracy or an autocracy. But you write about the Hobson state early on in the book. Where do we stand in terms of the rule of law? Where were we then in the beginning, 30, 40 years, and where are we now in the last 30, 40 years or so?
So that's another paradox we highlight, that while India established macro order, it failed to do and establish micro order, what we might call rule of law, right? And we show evidence from riots to student strife, to labor strife, communal violence, all the other forms of micro disorder. We know, in fact, the first reports of the Law Commission in the 50s speak about mounting court pendencies. Every decade, there's a Law Commission report or a parliamentary on mounting court pendencies. And what happens? They continue to mount, right? And we know the many consequences of, this, because after all, courts are supposed to settle disputes. They are not settled. And so they are then begin to get settled in what we call the shadow of the law. Right. Now, why didn't India do better on what we call quotidian law and order, day-to-day life, right? And that's where the other side of the democracy comes in, which is right from the 50s, there are concerns, and we put and read about 3,000 official government reports. And what is interesting when you read the reports is you realize how early on some of these issues are being identified, but nothing happens. And one of it is how politicized the police is becoming, how much the politicians are trying to control and use them, the transfer Raj of the policeman who doesn't listen to what the politician wants. That's becoming clear. And periodically attempts are made. So the biggest one was the National Police Commission report of the late 1970s. Given everything that happened in the emergency, there was a demand in the aftermath of the Shah Commission report on the excesses of the police. Huge effort in the National Police Commission report. It's like 13, 14 volumes. But the report comes out just when Mrs. Gandhi comes back to power.
We've already touched upon quite a few points on how this was a very slow and grinding process for India in the early years, right? Do you think with that slow and grinding process, we bought some stability? I mean, because the thing is that, with electoral politics, with democracy, with the sort of diversity that you have in the country, the geographies that you have, maybe we couldn't have moved any faster. Do you think that is the case? Or did we bungle some things up along the way?
No, I think that, you can't entirely exonerate some of the early choices we made. I mean, I do think that not being able to do labor-intensive manufacturing has been very, very costly for India. Now, some of it was because of the early choices which were given, but some of it we chose. I mean, first let me give you an illustration of how costly this choice was on this. So just take, let's say in the last, recent thing, China has about 20 to 25% of the global labor force. India also has 20 to 25% of the global labor force. Now, you would think that if you have so many kind of relatively unskilled labor, you should be able to produce and export a kind of comparable amount. But guess what? China occupies about 50% of the global export market share in labor-intensive goods, and India accounts for about 2 to 3% of this. So the difference between that 2% and what we should have had, something like 20, 25%, is kind of the massive lost opportunity in terms of labor skill production, exports, and employment. So this is a huge cost. And I think part of it was because of the choices we made. And this choice not only affected employment, formal manufacturing jobs for a lot, it also affected jobs for women. Now, if you look at Bangladesh, for example, and say compare it with West Bengal, which is, neighbor, similar culture, etc., Bangladesh, its apparel and export industry took off. And now Bangladesh is about something like 5 to 7% of global export market share. But that progress on exporting actually transformed Bangladesh socially in terms of female empowerment, female literacy, all kinds of, age at marriage, age at having children. So the whole social transformation that happened because of labor-intensive manufacturing, which turned out to be female labor-intensive manufacturing, I think those kinds of costs we paid very hugely. Now, just last point, and I'll stop here. Now, why I think we cannot exonerate our policymakers is that, look, if you said between 1950 and 1980, we didn't do all these things, the answer was obvious. We had planning, we had, inefficient public sector, we crushed the private sector, we should have. But after 1990 especially, we eliminated all the things that we did badly earlier. We got high and rapid economic growth, but we did not get the structural transformation in terms of policy making, etc. And that aspect, I think, has a lot to do with some of the choices we made in terms of what we did to our private sector, how, just to give you one example of the choices we made, which still affects. So today, for example, even today, and this was much worse, in the 90s, today manufacturing pays twice the price of electricity than it should, and twice the price that firms in China make, right? And this is because even today, we have a public sector monopoly in distribution of electricity, which, raises the costs. Part of it is because of our socialism. We say, well, we'll subsidize households and farmers, but to recover that, we have to tax industry. And did the same in railways. We still do the same in railways. So these are all choices that we are responsible for. And I think it's proving very costly. We're making some progress now. Tamil Nadu and other states are attracting manufacturing, but the long-term consequences and costs have been pretty massive.
This book, as we were discussing, is basically a bird's eye view, as I said, of the arc of India's basically journey in the last 75 years. It's a big picture book, right? And that is something that was basically, we've also discussed that, it was missing in the country to a large extent. But in this book, I'd like to actually, you write in the book that if the central government made at least occasional attempts at studying administrative reforms and very occasionally launched new initiatives, state governments did not even go through the pretense of trying, right? You've spoken up in detail about the states. Why did you think there was this need to get into the details of the states to this level in the book?
When we think about the failures of the Indian state, our mind turns to public goods, right? So, we sort of use this sort of what we call the 7 or 8 Ps. If you think about pavements or footpaths, all you have to do is to walk around Gurugram, you know what the pavements are, right? And that's true of any town or city. Public libraries, parks, public health, primary education, police, pollution, public transport. They are all state subjects, right? Constitutionally, these are all state subjects. We normally think, we have debates on centralization in India, and it's usually the relationship between New Delhi and the states. What we show in the book is, if you look at the 3 largest countries in the world, China, India, and the United States, China and the US have completely different political systems. Yet, in both countries, public employees are either at the federal level or at the local level, very few at the state level. India is exactly the opposite. Most public employees are at the state level. So the real centralization in India, we point out, is the relationship not between tier 1 and tier 2 of government, but between tier 2 and tier 3 of government. Which is why our cities are in the mess that they are, because cities have very little autonomy, notwithstanding the 74th Amendment. So which is why, given that so many of what we call the challenges India faces, whether it's pollution or garbage removal or clean water or better schools, these are state subjects, therefore the need to focus on the states.
Do you think there was a time in our country when basically states were doing equally as badly or as well as they were doing? Do you think there's enough competition in the states right now? It's a 2-part question. And the second is, what do you think is the reason that the southern states are doing so much better compared to the Hindi heartland states?
So, it's a very good question. Let me give you a concrete example of Tamil Nadu. The labor codes have been, changed and reformed. I think it's an excellent reform. It's, particularly if it reduces the compliance burdens on countries and so on. But the one thing I think you have to understand about labor reform and labor codes is investors obviously care about what's in the law, but the confidence of investors is created by how states actually implement the law in practice. And especially in bad times, how does the state behave? So let me give you one example from Tamil Nadu, which I think really distinguishes, and it's actually a very powerful idea, which I think we don't give enough credence to. In 2022 or 23, Ford Motor Company wanted to exit from Tamil Nadu because it was rebalancing its global strategy and said it's no longer profitable to produce in Tamil Nadu. So it said, we want to leave. Most state governments in India would have said, how dare you, what's wrong with us, etc., etc. The Tamil Nadu government actually facilitated its exit, because exit, we don't realize, there are massive land issues and there are massive labor issues. You have to sort out, what are your pension obligations, etc., etc. But the Tamil Nadu government actually facilitated the exit both on land and labor in practice under difficult circumstances. 2025, Ford Motor Company said, we have re-evaluated our global plans and we are thinking of coming back to India, and we will come back to Tamil Nadu because of the experience of, facilitating exit. So there's one insight here we forget, and our friend Shomitra Chatterjee has a very nice work on this, that in terms of labor codes, land laws, everything, how you facilitate exit is very important for attracting entry. So that's kind of the first point about, whatever. Now, I think the broader point is that when we said 1/3 of India has grown as fast as China, one of the implications of that is, the Hindi heartland, for example, the 2/3 that did not grow, it doesn't have to say, what did China do that we did? It can simply say, what has Tamil Nadu done, which, we can also emulate, and that's happening. So I think now there is competitive federalism. We know that all these countries are attracting. That's a good thing because, it puts pressure on states. But we should also be careful not to overdo competitive federalism also, because it has a darker side. Competitive federalism can be competitive populism also. All these cash transfer schemes, Devesh gives 100, I give 200, you give 500, and that messes up, fiscal thing. And also, as we speak on this, trying to attract all these data centers and investment, there is a kind of race to the bottom that's happening, which is not all desirable, kind of violating, the kind of over-the-top practices, corporate tax benefits or whatever. It is a zero-sum game, and we want to avoid some of that.
What, in your opinion, is the road ahead in terms of forces of optimism or areas of improvement, or maybe lessons that we can learn from other developing economies?
Well, for me, the source of optimism is young people like you. That is, you are the future, we are the past. So in that sense, to me, wherever we could go around, we've gone down a lot. It's just incredible, the energy young people bring, the idealism they bring. And to me, if there's one source of optimism, it's our youth. It's not old people like us.
Just to add, you said what is our recommendation. So we end the book, as Devesh said, on this note of optimism. But if there's one prescription, we say we're not going to give you prescriptions in terms of what needs to be done, because what needs to be done is well known. So the only thing we say in the concluding chapter is, do no harm. The Hippocratic Oath, they tell doctors do no harm, in the specific sense that all the achievements we've had, nation building, democracy, institutions, cooperative federalism, these are really valuable legacies from the first 30, 40 years. Let's not lose them because, social harmony, whatever. Because if we lose them, the long-run consequences for development could be quite adverse and serious.
Are there other countries who are as brand conscious? And why has India become so brand conscious in the last 10, 15 years? And what will it take for us to talk more about the not so sexy, not so cool stuff?
It has become brand conscious because our politics changed. That's the fundamental answer. The political leadership just believes that marketing gets votes. But I think all marketing, which is where the substance is weak, at some point will face reality. And I think there is no better wake-up moment than how and what Trump did to India. 1 year ago, would any one of us had said that India would have the highest tariff imposed by the US and China would have much less the tariff? Is there anything that India produces that the world cannot do without? So what's happening in the northern and western borders, what President Trump is doing, how the world order is changing, and we realize that if you do have a G2 situation, you really, really are squeezed. My sense is that realization is dawning on the leadership, but they do not know how to handle it. Because you have built this house of illusions for so long, it's not easy to climb down. And so that all the issues you've talked about are fundamental for India's long-term development. It's not that the awareness is not there at all, but marketing requires always much more flashy stuff, as you said. Everyone now talks of AI, but the fact that most children are, how many of India's children have stunting, how many simply cannot read or write a simple paragraph or do a plain addition, subtraction. It is a real shame for the country. But in the end, that reality, simply by brushing it away, doesn't mean the reality doesn't exist. And at least my hope is that what has happened in the past few months is a wake-up call for the much tougher challenges in a world that is going to be in much greater turmoil.
So just the one point to add is that I think the beauty of India, I agree with everything Devesh said, and I just said earlier that we had a remarkably self-reflecting state, self-flagellating state, but not a self-correcting state. Maybe we need to revise that with the new politics. We're not so self-reflecting and so on. Yeah. Congratulatory and this. But I think, remember, the hope for India is three things, right? Large federal country, therefore many, many different things happen in many, many different places. One, right? So you're always going to be getting, despite whatever the marketing and the hype is going to. Second, I think we shouldn't give up hope on society. After all, Pratham, civil society organization, is the one that's pointed out that there are all these problems. So civil society still has a role to play. And finally, coming back to the thing about India's youth, they know when they're being shortchanged. No amount of marketing can change that. And therefore, the youth, society, the diversity of India can be a force for correcting this overly self-congratulatory kind of bubble that I think our current politics has produced.
India is very distinctive.
There is a overwhelmingly bipartisan consensus because the caricature of complexity is the reality. It's an early phase.
So one of the surprising things about our story,
India cannot grow as China.
30 million people.
Couple of thoughts, right?
Probably four central distinctive aspects of the book. One is we see the development as necessarily something to be approached through an interdisciplinary approach. We didn't want to examine India's development story through the silos of one specific discipline. A second distinctive feature, at least the way we saw it, is that we came to this book without strong priors. And we were determined to tell this story through the data. A third sort of feature, we did not want to make judgments on what happened in different periods of time with the hindsight of history. A fourth feature of the book is that it is comparative. It's comparative over time. It's comparative in comparing India with similar large countries, and in particular, of course, China. So, what were some of the surprises that we found? The first was one of the absolute prerequisites of development for any country. We contrast this, of course, in as we think about order, a different way in which, for economists, we think about disorder is hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is a manifestation of extreme economic disorder. So one of the surprising things about our story, that macro order. Second thing that we were surprised was state-owned enterprises. The third surprise was on the structure of the Indian state.
Something we discovered is that when we were looking at the states, we discovered that 1/3 of India by population grew almost as fast as China and almost as long since 1980. Democracy is such a beautiful, accommodator of not just few vested interests, but many, many vested interests, on the tax side and on the expenditure side, which is the second surprising fact. The third surprising fact has to do with fiscal federalism, very topical these days. The reason for the grievance, I think, is that these transfers have been rising and rising and rising over time. So these are three surprising facts. In the book, we write about the license Raj, and we write about the fertilizer subsidy regime in the license Raj. Even all the omniscient gods put together cannot come up with this, because the caricature of complexity is the reality. And the last point I want to end on is this whole we're talking about complexity, but there's a deep puzzle about the Indian state pathology, which I think relates to mybapism. So if you take today, I think one of the most sectors that is holding back the Indian economy is the power sector. In India today, about 60 to 65% of the subsidy provided to households on power goes to the middle class and the rich. It doesn't go to poor consumers. So there's something that is going on here which is kind of eludes full understanding, but which is holding back India tremendously. And I think the time has come to kind of address some of these pathologies.
You use the word right at the beginning of your book, precocious, and you use it in many dimensions. Economically precocious. This gives me the impression that you guys have a certain idea of the natural order of things. Can you clarify what you mean by this term precocious? Because I think a number of people are going to be troubled by it when they read your book.
So we are using only precocious not because it is our natural order, but relative to what other countries have done. So it's only in a comparative sense. Good. We are just saying it did that and it had consequences.
Any assessment you make has to have a benchmark. And in this sense, that's why it's the international benchmark that we use in a fairly positive, not in a normative sense. We also use precociousness in terms of the policy choices that were made.
You say on the one hand that South India grew like China. Now, we didn't grow through manufacturing except Tamil Nadu, right? So we grew with services. Are you saying that had no impact on employment, on welfare, etc.? This upsurge we saw in China-like growth in South India?
Manufacturing employment and GDP in these states was much higher than the less successful states, but they were not quite at the level of China and Korea. So it's true that therefore we did get growth rates without the kind of things. But of course the other commonality, at least for Tamil Nadu and Gujarat with China, is having had the social reform movements from the bottom up.
People reading your book, or reading reviews of your book at least, are saying that you have an extremely static concept of caste. And you've used it almost in a parametric way. You haven't explored sort of the argument that, it's people are better off in terms of caste discrimination today. That doesn't sufficiently explain what kind of barrier caste presents to the development problem. That is not one of your sort of focal points at all in the book. So in fact, there's a large school of thought, including in this city, which believes that India may have ameliorated caste and we have not annihilated it. And that sort of consensus on not annihilating things has resulted in outcomes which you don't actually discuss, such as 90% of civil servants being from the top 3 castes. In the end, you may have reservation, but in the end of the pipeline, 90% of Supreme Court judges, it's actually one of the best places we have some caste reform. Almost the entire military, the media, us economists. Difficult for me to think of a Dalit economist, actually. And this is a plaint that has come from my students in this city and other people writing to me. So obviously this is a plaint, and this is your chance to perhaps explore in some length, what your take on caste is, rather than respond to this plaint, and how you would see that fitting into your arguments in the book.
The obsession with caste has led to the other major sort of social cleavage in India, gender, being put on the side. All the major caste-based parties, you will see, have almost no female, leaders. You don't have to go to the Supreme Court. You have to ask the caste-based parties, where are your female, leaders? So there are many other factors that are going into this, of which undoubtedly the prejudices continue, all of that. That is undoubtedly true.
But that is obviously why this is such a good book, because it raises the question, and in disagreeing with it, you can perhaps explore it further. Let me move on to my third point, which is mine, actually. You've given the Indian private sector a bit of a free pass in this book. I mean, you've said all the right things, that there's crony capitalism, and there's rent-seeking and all that. But we don't really have, notwithstanding what people in Hyderabad think or Bangalore think, a sort of robust capitalist class, right? Yet. There's far too much rent-seeking going on. There's a lot of feudalism involved in the nature of capitalism. And the public sector, which you so love to decry, perhaps, was a response to that. I mean, certainly I happen to know, because I've studied it carefully, that bank nationalization happened because the people running banks and insurance companies in this country in the mid-1960s were a bunch of scoundrels who were
And LIC as well.
and everything. That man with 7 mistresses, Dalmia, and that sort of thing, right? So, and what it did bring about, therefore, was a sense of confidence in the financial system, and therefore that was necessary. This is not to justify PM Modi's interventions, which have nothing to do with this whatsoever. So that's my takeaway. Now, obviously, you will think, I hope you will think differently, but to help the audience understand, what is your take on the Indian private sector in this journey that you described?
You want to start? Okay.
See, you're absolutely right that the weakness, if you want to call it, of the Indian bourgeoisie in the 1950s, 60s was a major impetus for pushing for the public sector. But it is also the case that one of the things we don't take up, we just mentioned, but because we were running out of space, it was becoming too large, is, why is, say, entrepreneurship, for instance, so unevenly distributed across the country, right? Is there a sociological explanation? I grew up in Calcutta, and most of Bengal's business community was from outside the state. And when capital fled Bengal, there wasn't domestic capital or capitalists or entrepreneurs that could pick up that slack. It's not easy for entrepreneurs who simply don't want to pay up to actually flourish. It is a big challenge, and we have to face up to that. So again, what is cause, what is effect?
How do you see the evolution of capitalism since 1991 in the context of the questions that you raise in the book?
Yeah, see, a couple of thoughts, right? It is true, and this is a point that I thought Devesh would make, that if you look at the innovation done by Indian private sector firms, it's pitifully small. If you look at the IT sector, which has been so successful, I mean, we have not really created, the kinds of things that China has created, et cetera, et cetera. And, we're still in this GCC, writing cheap code, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, I think the private sector has something to answer for as well. But I think it is something that we should evaluate more carefully.
Yeah, well, think about why it's not 10%. There must be a logical reason why people keep putting money in public sector banks. It's not all linear. Go on.
I think the point that I forgot that Arvind added, it is striking how much India is an outlier in the low share of the private sector in R&D expenditure.
So the Tamil Nadu model of development, which was, Periyar movement and a religious to a degree and then a casteist to a significant degree. So is that a great catalyst for growth? I mean, which is like, so if you say Tamil Nadu versus Bihar or something, they're diametric opposites, right? I mean, Periyar literally made a level playing field and made it very meritocratic. So is a question then that the alignment into religion and caste, which may happen again now in the current scenario again, is that does that correlate negatively with growth is what I'm trying to ask.
Look, I think there was we talked about social movements, but there was one fundamental handicap that large parts of the Hindi heartland and Bengal had, which was the land settlement under the British. The zamindari system, in the way the land settlement was done, created a very pernicious feudal structure in much of UP, Bihar, and Bengal. So that feudal structure had very deep, long-term negative consequences. And then that also meant that having social movements was also harder because you had this entrenched feudal power structure, which is much harder to break. So, of course, when land reforms were attempted in the 50s, some modest things happened. Bengal, after the CPM came back to power, had some more. But by and large, we know that these were thwarted because, as has been pointed out by many others, the Congress party, its own elite base was among rural landlords and the landed elite. So this is one case where we point out no democracy has ever had successful land reforms, period. Land reforms around the world have only happened after revolutions. Absolutely the case. I mean, but I'm saying serious land reforms. You've had 10-year relation, but redistribution of land on a massive scale we saw it, East Asian success. One of the key criteria was when the Americans occupied after World War II, Japan, Korea, it was under them that the land reforms happened. Same in Taiwan, because you had a new group coming in, Chiang Kai-shek, when they fled, they had land reform. But again, it was in a scenario where you basically had a complete change in the political regime, lock, stock, and barrel, right? So the North had, in that way, it had another handicap, which was the freight equalization policy, which really handicapped Bengal and Bihar because it meant that mineral resources that were key, coal, iron ore, etc., which were in Bihar and Bengal, were available at equal. So the comparative advantage, it could not be taken. And of course, the freight equalization policy ends in the early 90s. But by that time, of course, things had already sort of entrenched around. So I think these two things, there's no doubt that the playing field was not level for large parts of the north and east.
So, in addition to what Devesh said, your question was there a difference even at the starting point, right? And if you look at the, say, per capita GDP and broadly the human development indices in 1960, there was, generally the southern states and West Bengal were better off than the Hindi heartland. But the margin was, it's not minuscule, but not huge. What happens is that this kind of differential in, per capita GDP and this actually broadly continues till about 1980, 1990. The big divergence between the Hindi heartland and the South happens after the mid-80s. Why? Because essentially in the first 30 years, whatever the initial differences were, they were kept in check because politically, fiscally, and policy-wise, there was total centralization. Planning meant centralization, which meant limited agency for the states. So when around 85, 90, political decentralization took place, policies became more decentralized, fiscally it became more decentralized, then states had agency, and then whatever the differences in capability, human capital, policies, that came into effect. And that's when the explosion happened. So initial advantage, yes, kept in check by the policies of centralization and socialism. Once those are removed, the agency of states gets reflected. And so, for example, West Bengal, deteriorates dramatically over this because of what West Bengal did, despite its head start initially. Similarly, Punjab started well, was the fastest growing state. In 1987, it had the highest per capita GDP, but then collapsed thereafter because of what happened in Punjab. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that there are initial conditions, but they were kept in check. And once they acquired agency is when this explosion, divergence happened. So that's on that question. On the China-India question, if I can, I'm not sure how exactly what the question was, but remember that by and this is one of the things we show in the book, 1950, India and China are roughly in the same position, roughly, on, per capita GDP, agricultural production, Human Development Index, roughly similar, not exactly. By 1962, which is when the Great Leap Forward happens, many of these indicators are better for India than for China. But by 1980, that everything gets reversed, and China is already way ahead of India, especially on human capital indicators, health, and agricultural yields. And so when the liberalization happens in 1978 in China and then 1991, it's not so much, obviously the manner in which and the pace in which the two countries liberalized was somewhat different, and we can go into it. But that initial difference also played a key part because, Chinese human capital is much better. So in a sense, the human capital, the only comparable states in India with those kinds of human capital were the southern states. And it's kind of not surprising that they did as well as China. So I think the thing to understand, what I want to impress upon you is that, yes, after 1978, both countries liberalized. And then after having written this book, everyone will say, give us a list of 3 or 4 or 5 or top things. And we studiously desist from doing that.
Another thing, when you write a book like this, you realize that if I say India needs to improve human capital, is that news like to you? The Indian state should be more effective. Is that news to you? If I say Delhi needs to reduce pollution, we know all of these things. It's not, we don't have anything outstandingly novel. We know that the hard part is not the what, but the how, right? And the how almost always, as Arvind has pointed out, is not because some brilliant academics have some brilliant insights. It's because there are large structural forces, whether it's crises, whether it's technology, or you have by chance a particular happenstance change in sort of leadership that is just different. It's not because Arvind and I wrote a book that is a nice book and it has some prescriptions.
So thank you very much for furthering that conversation. We're delighted to host you in Hyderabad. Thank you for choosing the Quorum as a place to come and interact with us, and have a good time in polluted Delhi. Welcome out of dynamic India back to Delhi Darbar for you tomorrow. Bye bye. Thank you very much, everyone.